The CEO of our cybersecurity startup called my core encryption protocol spaghetti trash written by a basement troll. He laughed about it in front of everyone. 3 days later, he tried to fire me and sell that exact code to a global defense contractor for $400 million. He thought he could steal everything and walk away a visionary. He had no idea I was about to lock him out of his own empire. Hello, dear listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for your continuous love and support. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero operating budget, which means we are forced to stop our activities here and will no longer publish new videos to the public. If you find today's story captivating, please support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel, where you will find exclusive true stories that are even better, significantly longer, and packed with detailed situations we simply cannot share on YouTube, featuring multiple emotional voice actors bringing each tale to life. You can easily join us by scanning the Patreon QR code right there on your screen or by clicking the link located in the description or the comments section of this video. Let us dive right into today's drama and introduce you to our main character, Hannah Moore. I am 34 years old, and until recently, I was the lead security architect at OmniVault Networks, a cybersecurity startup based in Austin, Texas. People call Austin a miniature Silicon Valley, but that is just a polite way of saying it has inherited all the toxic, hyper-competitive garbage of the tech world without any of the actual innovation. My life consisted of black coffee and endless, sleepless nights, while everyone else was attending networking mixers and drinking overpriced craft beer. I was chained to my desk, single-handedly building Ironclad. Ironclad was our core encryption protocol, the absolute backbone of the company. It was the only thing standing between our clients and total digital devastation. Then there was Julian. Julian was our chief executive officer, a slick business school graduate whose greatest talent was wearing expensive vests and selling empty promises to gullible investors. He knew absolutely nothing about cybersecurity or coding. To him, software engineers were just digital sweatshop workers meant to churn out product features at breakneck speed so he could hit his quarterly metrics. He strutted around the office throwing buzzwords into the air, pretending he understood the architecture I was bleeding to create every single day. The pinnacle of his absolute disrespect happened during an all-hands meeting on a Tuesday morning. The entire company was gathered in the main glass conference room, and Julian was presenting a live demo to our board members via a massive video call. Suddenly, a minor user interface bug occurred. A graphics rendering issue made a dashboard graph load 2 seconds late. Instead of smoothly moving past it, Julian panicked and decided he needed a scapegoat to look strong in front of the board. He pulled up the back-end code on the huge projector screen, my back-end code, and pointed at it with a laser pointer as if he were exposing a major crime. "Look at this," Julian announced, his voice echoing loudly across the room. "This is exactly why we are having latency issues. This is spaghetti trash written by a basement troll. We need clean, scalable architecture, not this amateur hour garbage." He said that while looking right over the crowd, indirectly staring at me, he publicly humiliated me in front of 80 people over a front-end glitch that had absolutely nothing to do with my security backend. The code he was calling trash was the exact mathematical fortress currently protecting all of our client data. But Julian did not fire me right then and there. He was too cowardly for that, and somewhere deep down, he knew the system would collapse without my daily oversight. Instead, the following week, he hired Marcus. Marcus was a smooth-talking chief technology officer imported directly from a massive corporate firm. He possessed shiny degrees from prestigious universities, but had an entirely empty head when it came to modern encryption. Julian paraded Marcus around the office and loudly declared that Marcus was brought in to clean up Hannah's trash and bring adult supervision to the engineering team. Overnight, I was subjected to a stealth demotion. I was quietly removed from the Ironclad development pipeline. Marcus took over my team, and I was shoved into a dark corner to handle legacy system maintenance. I was pushed out of every important meeting, every architectural review, and every strategic discussion. They expected me to throw a fit, cry, or storm out and quit, surrendering all my unvested equity in the process. I did none of those things. I stayed. I sat at my desk, sipping my bitter coffee, watching everything with cold, calculating eyes. Let Marcus take the credit. Let Julian act like a conquering king, because there was a massive secret hiding inside that so-called spaghetti trash, a secret neither of them had the intellectual capacity to comprehend. The code Julian had mocked on that projector screen was not messy because I was a bad programmer. It was complex because it contained a proprietary quantum-resistant security layer that I had taught myself and implemented in secret. The algorithms were dense, multi-layered mathematical labyrinths designed to withstand brute force attacks from next-generation supercomputers. It was a masterpiece of modern security. And the best part was that absolutely no one at Omnivault Networks, especially not the shiny new Chief Technology Officer, had the technical skill to read it, understand it, or replicate it. They were blindly driving a tank they thought was a golf cart, and I held the only key to the engine. The isolation of my new cubicle located directly adjacent to the Human Resources Department provided an unexpected tactical advantage. The drywall was painfully thin, and the Human Resources Director, a highly stressed woman named Sarah, possessed a terrible habit of taking sensitive phone calls on speaker. It was on a mundane Thursday afternoon that I clearly heard the name Apex Global echoing through the partition. They were a massive, publicly traded multinational defense contractor. According to Sarah's frantic scheduling of legal audits, Apex Global was preparing to acquire our startup for exactly $400 million. My mind instantly snapped into a rigid, analytical mode. An acquisition of that colossal magnitude meant rigorous due diligence, massive executive payouts, and a thorough cleansing of the current employee roster. I knew Julian, with his insatiable greed, would not let me walk away with a financial windfall. I needed concrete proof of his intentions. I did not require physical access to Sarah's computer to find the truth. I had personally designed the internal network architecture, deliberately leaving a quiet, heavily encrypted administrative backdoor for emergency system diagnostics. I smoothly bypassed the standard authentication protocols and infiltrated the executive email server. Reading through Julian's private inbox was equivalent to taking a masterclass in corporate sociopathy. I quickly located a restricted thread between him and our external corporate lawyers, discussing the definitive acquisition timeline. The deal was set to close in exactly 6 weeks. Then, scanning further down, I saw my name. Julian had explicitly instructed Human Resources to terminate my employment under the guise of organizational restructuring exactly 3 days before the acquisition signing date. His twisted rationale was typed out in cold black and white letters. By terminating my contract just 72 hours prior to the official close, all of my unvested shares would automatically be forfeited back into the corporate equity pool. This calculated maneuver would inflate Julian's personal payout by several $1 million. A normal person might have felt a crushing wave of despair or blinding anger upon reading that email. I felt nothing but a sharp, clinical, and dangerous clarity. The battlefield was set, and the rules of engagement were entirely corporate law. Rather than confronting Julian in a fit of rage, I pivoted my focus entirely to my personal employee dossier. If they wanted to play a ruthless game of legal technicalities to steal my hard-earned equity, I would meticulously audit the very weapons they intended to use against me. I pulled up the digital archives of every single document I had ever signed since the day I was initially hired. I began a rigorous process of cross-referencing my employment contracts and employee handbooks against standard Texas state corporate law requirements and federal intellectual property statutes. I read every clause and every tiny line of fine print with the precision of a surgeon. That was when I discovered the fatal structural flaw in the paper empire Julian had built. During the chaotic early days of the startup, the Human Resources Department had been a complete operational disaster. They had onboarded me in a massive rush. I had signed the initial standard employment contract and a basic non-disclosure agreement. However, I never signed an intellectual property assignment agreement for the major architectural overhaul I completed during my second year. That overhaul was the exact mathematical evolution that transformed the basic security system into the impenetrable version of ironclad currently protecting the company. In the strict eyes of corporate legal frameworks, an employer only owns the intellectual property of an employee if there is a legally binding, explicitly signed transfer of rights specifically covering that creation. Because of their sheer administrative negligence, I retained 100% of the copyright to the core encryption algorithm. The company did not legally own Ironclad. They were simply borrowing it on an informal basis. I sat back in my office chair and let a slow smile form on my face. Julian was trying to sell a $400 million digital fortress, while I secretly held the only legally binding deed to the foundation it was built upon. The sheer audacity of his greed had entirely blinded him to the legal structural integrity of his own company. I decided to maintain silence. I did not send a single panicked message to human resources to correct the oversight. Instead, I calmly initiated a highly secure data transfer protocol. I systematically downloaded my initial employment contract, conspicuously lacking the assignment clause and thousands of lines of cryptographic commit logs, proving I was the sole author of the advanced security layer. Furthermore, I exported every single abusive email where Julian had mocked my code, establishing a definitive timeline of his extreme hostility. I dumped all of this undeniable legal and technical evidence onto a solid-state physical hard drive. Securing the device with military-grade encryption, the legal trap was now perfectly laid out in the shadows. The clock was ticking relentlessly. I knew Marcus was clumsily auditing administrative permissions, attempting to map out the network architecture so he could eventually revoke my master access credentials. He was slow, but he was not entirely stagnant. I had an incredibly narrow window of opportunity to execute my final maneuver. It felt exactly like being the inside architect of a massive digital bank heist, operating right under the noses of the guards. My fingers flew across my mechanical keyboard, drafting the most critical lines of code of my entire career. I packaged my payload within a completely mundane shell, labeling it as a routine dependency update for our secondary logging servers. It looked boring, standard, and completely invisible to a superficial code review. Buried deep beneath that routine maintenance patch was a highly sophisticated dead man's switch. I engineered it utilizing an advanced zero-knowledge proof protocol to the naked eye, and even to routine automated security scans. The system would continue to function with absolute perfection. Daily operations, client data processing, and standard server queries would run completely unimpeded. However, the switch was designed to actively monitor the environmental host variables of the core repository. If it detected an attempt to package, duplicate, and migrate the foundational source code to an external server architecture not owned by our specific network domain, such as a mass transfer during a corporate acquisition, the trap would instantly spring shut. The moment an external compilation was attempted, the switch would trigger a cascading lockdown sequence. It would freeze the migration and demand a unique cryptographic handshake. That handshake required a biometric decryption hash and a localized private key that existed exclusively on an offline drive sitting safely in my personal backpack. I ensured there was absolutely no way to bypass it through brute force or reverse engineering. To make the trap legally sound and dripping with poetic justice, I hard-coded a specific manual override sequence. The terminal would only accept a singular, highly specific proprietary command string to unlock the migration. I typed the activation phrase into the terminal, verifying the syntax perfectly, spaghetti_trash_override. While I was deploying this invisible bomb into the company servers, Marcus was parading around the open plan office, radiating unearned confidence. He strolled past my cubicle multiple times a day, holding his expensive artisanal lattes, speaking loudly into his wireless earpiece. I could hear him bragging to the board of directors about how he was personally streamlining the back-end operations and trimming the fat from the engineering department. He was actively submitting weekly progress reports, taking full credit for the flawless stability of the very system he could not even begin to comprehend. He believed he had thoroughly conquered the digital landscape, completely oblivious to the fact that he was proudly standing on a landmine that I had just armed. With the trap set and the master key secured in my possession, my anxiety completely evaporated, replaced by a chilling sense of absolute control. Over the next 2 days, I slowly and methodically began packing my personal belongings into a small cardboard box. I took my favorite mechanical keyboard, my noise-canceling headphones, and a few desk ornaments. I left the company hardware pristine and untouched. I knew exactly what was coming. Right on schedule, at exactly 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. My desk phone rang. It was Sarah from Human Resources requesting my presence in Conference Room B. I picked up my cardboard box, tucked it under my arm, and walked down the hallway with a perfectly measured stride. When I opened the door, Julian was sitting at the head of the long oak table, wearing a crisp, tailored suit, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Sarah sat next to him, nervously shuffling a stack of legal papers. "Hannah, please take a seat," Julian commanded, using his best imitation of a powerful executive. "As you know, we are constantly evaluating our organizational structure to ensure maximum efficiency. Unfortunately, your role has become redundant under the new leadership of Marcus. We are terminating your employment, effective immediately." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a standard termination notice. There was no severance package offered. There was not a single cent of transitional compensation. He was kicking me out into the street just days before the massive acquisition, exactly as he had planned, stripping me of every single unvested share of equity I had bled to earn. "Sign at the bottom to acknowledge receipt," Julian said, leaning back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "We need your security badge and your laptop right now." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, cry, or beg for my job. I picked up the pen, signed my name with a smooth, fluid motion, and placed my plastic security badge neatly on top of the laptop. "Thank you for the opportunity," I replied, my voice completely flat and void of any emotion. I picked up my cardboard box and turned my back on them. As I walked out of the glass doors of the office building and stepped into the warm Texas evening, I did not feel like a victim who had just been robbed of millions of dollars. I felt a profound, dangerous calm. I was a hunter who had just meticulously camouflaged the final snare, and all I had to do now was wait for the prey to step directly into it. The week following my termination, the OmniVault Network's office transformed into a premature victory parade. From the steady stream of text messages sent by my former colleagues, I learned that our previously sterile corporate environment was suddenly drowning in catered champagne lunches, expensive artisan cupcakes, and a sickening atmosphere of unearned triumph. Julian was in his absolute element, basking in the radiant glow of a wildly successful fraud. He had seamlessly shifted into the role of a visionary technology pioneer, booking back-to-back interviews with major financial news outlets and local Austin tech publications. I watched one of his video interviews online, my face completely expressionless as he confidently stared into the camera and spun a massive web of lies. He spoke passionately about his grand cybersecurity vision, gesturing wildly with his hands as he explained how he personally architected the Ironclad protocol. He even claimed that his background in business administration provided the unique lateral thinking required to solve complex cryptography problems. He was selling a narrative of a lone genius chief executive, conveniently erasing the reality that he could not even write a basic automated script to save his own life. Meanwhile, the technical audit team from Apex Global descended upon the office to conduct their rigorous due diligence before a massive defense contractor transfers $400 million into a startup bank account. They send their brightest analytical minds to aggressively poke holes in the merchandise. This was where the corporate comedy truly peaked. Marcus, the newly minted master of my domain, found himself trapped in high-stakes interrogation rooms with actual senior security engineers. According to the internal gossip filtering back to me, Marcus was sweating through his expensive designer shirts on a daily basis. When the Apex Global auditors demanded granular mathematical explanations of the core quantum-resistant algorithms, Marcus panicked. He possessed zero actual understanding of the architecture, so he deployed his only defense mechanism. He regurgitated a thick, confusing soup of meaningless corporate buzzwords. He talked loudly about synergistic security paradigms, agile threat mitigation, and robust, scalable infrastructures. He desperately hoped the auditors would simply nod along, blindly trusting the system. He genuinely believed that software was like a sturdy concrete bridge. Once built, it simply stood there forever, operating perfectly on its own without requiring its original architect. The sheer arrogance of their charade climaxed on a Thursday evening at an upscale, dimly lit cocktail bar in downtown Austin. Julian, intoxicated by his impending wealth and a few too many glasses of premium bourbon, decided to hold court among a group of young, impressionable tech founders. He began bragging loudly about his brilliant strategic maneuvers, thinking he was completely untouchable. What he did not realize was that a former company engineer, a young man he had callously laid off 6 months prior, was sitting at the very next booth with his smartphone quietly recording the entire monologue. The audio file landed in my encrypted inbox less than an hour later. I pressed play and listened to Julian slurring his words. "You have to be utterly ruthless in this industry," Julian boasted on the recording, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "I just saved the company a few $1,000,000 by kicking out a useless nerd who had completely outlived her usefulness. She thought she was irreplaceable. Now she gets absolutely nothing, and I get a massive payout. That is just how the game is played by the big boys." I sat in the comfort of my own living room, dressed in loose, incredibly soft pajamas, listening to his arrogant confession loop for a second time. I did not feel a single ounce of rage or resentment. I poured myself a generous glass of rich red wine and gently swirled the liquid, admiring its deep crimson color against the warm, ambient light of my apartment. I took a slow sip, letting the complex, oaky flavors settle on my tongue. I was entirely at peace. On the coffee table in front of me, my open laptop displayed a highly secure, custom-built tracking dashboard. A silent countdown timer flashed in the corner of the screen, tracking the automated network activity within the OmniVault infrastructure. I knew the standard operating procedure for a defense-level acquisition inside and out. Apex Global would never simply hand over $400 million based on Marcus and his sweaty buzzwords. To finalize the deal and prove total, unencumbered ownership of the technology, they would strictly demand a full, live test migration. They would require Marcus to package the entire security core and successfully transfer it to their own heavily fortified external servers. The trap was armed, perfectly hidden in the digital brush. The prey was dancing blindly toward the edge of the cliff, celebrating their own cleverness. I checked the digital timestamp on my screen and took another calm, satisfied sip of wine. I knew exactly which day, and almost exactly which hour. Those absolute fools were going to press the button. Monday morning arrived with the blinding, unforgiving clarity of a Texas sunrise, painting the sleek, towering skyscrapers of downtown Austin in brilliant, piercing shades of gold. The grand closing ceremony for the acquisition was being held in a stunning, highly exclusive penthouse boardroom wrapped entirely in floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, offering a dizzying, panoramic view of the sprawling city below. A city that Julian firmly believed he now completely owned. The atmosphere inside the soundproofed room was incredibly thick, heavy with the sharp scent of expensive designer cologne and the quiet, electric hum of impending generational wealth. Julian was in his absolute element, dressed in his most expensive, meticulously tailored suit. It was a custom Italian masterpiece of dark navy wool that draped perfectly over his shoulders, paired with a subtle, shimmering silk tie that screamed corporate dominance and old money confidence. He sat directly at the center of the massive, polished mahogany conference table, a solid gold fountain pen resting loosely between his freshly manicured fingers. He was practically vibrating with unrestrained anticipation, ready to press that heavy gold pen to the final signature line and formally claim his $400 million prize. Directly across the wide table from him sat the imposing, highly scrutinizing delegation from Apex Global. They were a stark, sobering contrast to Julian's flashy, performative startup aesthetic. They were dressed uniformly in conservative charcoal gray suits, their expressions completely unreadable, heavily guarded, and strictly professional. Their lead corporate attorney, a sharp-featured, incredibly intimidating woman with piercing, analytical eyes, gave a slow, deliberate nod toward their chief technical director. It was officially time for the final, mandatory validation protocol. The technical director leaned forward, firmly intertwining his fingers, and formally requested that Marcus execute the final source code migration command. This was not a mere formality. It was the ultimate, non-negotiable test to unequivocally prove complete, unencumbered structural ownership of the encryption algorithm before the colossal transfer of funds could be legally authorized. Marcus stood up, aggressively puffing out his chest, completely eager to play the starring role of the master software architect in front of the massive, highly respected defense contractor. He confidently strode over to the master control terminal stationed prominently at the head of the boardroom. The high-resolution terminal screen was mirrored directly onto a massive 80-inch wall monitor, allowing everyone in the room to clearly witness the historic digital handover. Marcus flashed a cocky, reassuring, completely hollow smile at Julian, utterly unaware of the invisible digital guillotine hanging directly over his neck. He typed in the basic execution parameters, his trembling fingers dancing lightly across the mechanical keys, and with a theatrical, highly exaggerated flourish, he firmly struck the enter key. For a single, agonizingly suspended second, the enormous room remained absolutely silent, with every single pair of eyes waiting expectantly for the familiar, comforting green loading bar of a successful data compilation. Instead, the 80-inch display monitor, along with every single auxiliary screen integrated into the glass boardroom, violently flickered, emitted a sharp digital hiss, and plunged instantly into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The sudden, shocking absence of light from the screens sucked the air right out of the room, creating a vacuum of profound confusion. Then, burning violently through the dark background like a neon warning sign on a desolate highway, a single string of glowing red text materialized on the massive monitor. The letters were stark, aggressive, and undeniably fatal to the entire acquisition. The message read in bold, uncompromising capitalization: commercial transfer error, access denied by copyright owner, authentication, key required. The smug, victorious, completely unearned smile instantly vanished from Julian's face, rapidly replaced by a pale, sickening mask of absolute bewilderment and rising horror. Out in the real world, the core client protection protocols of Ironclad were still functioning perfectly, flawlessly guarding highly sensitive data without a single dropped packet or security glitch, performing exactly as I had meticulously designed them to do. However, the foundational source code attempting to be packaged for the corporate transfer was permanently locked in a cryptographic vault. Marcus stared blankly at the glaring red text, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror as the reality of the situation slowly fractured his inflated ego. He began to aggressively, desperately mash the keys on the master terminal, frantically typing standard override commands, desperate reboot sequences, and elementary bypass protocols. But the glowing red text remained completely unbothered, frozen on the screen, silently mocking his total, embarrassing incompetence. A cold, heavy sweat broke out rapidly across Marcus's forehead. Within moments, the entire back of his expensive designer shirt was entirely soaked, clinging desperately to his skin as he spiraled openly into a state of absolute, flailing, highly visible panic. The conservative, highly disciplined delegation from Apex Global immediately shifted their collective posture, completely abandoning their relaxed stances. The lead corporate attorney leaned back slowly in her plush leather chair, her brow furrowing into a deep, severe, and highly dangerous frown. She was a hardened veteran of high-stakes corporate warfare, and she could instantly smell the sharp, metallic scent of massive fraud bleeding directly into the room. She calmly but forcefully raised her hand, signaling Marcus to immediately stop his pathetic, desperate, and entirely useless typing. Her voice cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the boardroom like a perfectly sharpened razor blade. She demanded, with absolute, unwavering authority, to immediately see the original intellectual property ownership files, the patent registries, and the legally binding employee assignment contracts for the entire ironclad protocol. Julian began to stammer uncontrollably, his carefully constructed, confident facade shattering into a million pathetic pieces as he frantically looked toward his own internal legal counsel, who suddenly looked equally horrified, completely pale, and entirely empty-handed. It was exactly at that precise moment of absolute, suffocating despair, right when the entire $400 million illusion was collapsing under its own weight, that the heavy glass doors of the penthouse boardroom swung open. I walked into the room with slow, deliberate, and highly measured steps. I was no longer the exhausted, silent, invisible engineer hiding in the basement wearing oversized, faded hoodies and carrying dark, heavy circles under my eyes. I was wearing a sharply tailored, impeccably fitted midnight black power suit, my posture perfectly straight, my chin held high, my expression an impenetrable fortress of cold, calculated, and absolute authority. Cradled firmly in my left arm was a thick, meticulously organized, and heavily indexed stack of original, legally binding documents. The entire room froze in place, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity and the shocking timing of my uninvited arrival. Julian's face transitioned rapidly from a state of pale shock to a deep, explosive, furious crimson red. The prominent veins in his neck bulged dangerously against his silk collar as he slammed both of his hands violently onto the mahogany table. "Security. Get her out of here immediately. She is a disgruntled, insane former employee attempting to sabotage a private corporate event," Julian screamed hysterically at the top of his lungs. But before the heavy-set security guards stationed by the private elevators could even take 2 aggressive steps toward me to carry out his frantic orders, the lead technical director of Apex Global abruptly stood up from his chair. He had been staring intently at my face, squinting slightly, and then looking back down at the highly unique, incredibly complex error architecture permanently displayed on the massive screen. He sharply raised his right hand high into the air, presenting his firm palm directly toward the advancing security guards in a universal, undisputed gesture of absolute command, ordering them to halt their advance immediately. The lead technical director of Apex Global lowered his raised hand, his eyes locked intensely onto my face with a complex mixture of profound shock and immense professional respect. He stepped deliberately around the massive mahogany table, completely ignoring Julian, who was still sputtering loudly in a state of hyperventilating panic. The technical director pointed a sharp finger directly at the glowing red error architecture still dominating the 80-inch monitor on the wall. "I know that specific error handling structure," the technical director stated, his deep voice echoing authoritatively in the suddenly silent room. "I have studied it obsessively for the past 3 years. It is completely unique, an elegant, highly unorthodox cryptographic routing method posted by an anonymous developer on an obscure architectural repository online. I have read every single line of those white papers. That structural syntax is a digital fingerprint. It is a completely unforgeable coding signature." He turned to look at the bewildered delegation from his own company, and then he looked back at me with absolute certainty. "OmniVault Networks did not write this algorithm. They are attempting to sell us stolen property." I walked forward with calm, measured steps, and slammed the thick, heavy stack of legal documents squarely onto the polished table. The loud smack of the paper hitting the wood made Marcus jump violently out of his skin. I looked directly at the lead corporate attorney from Apex Global, bypassing Julian entirely as if he were nothing more than a meaningless shadow on the floor. "Inside that folder," I declared, my voice ringing with absolute razor-sharp clarity. You will find my original employment contract from the very first day this company was founded. You will notice the blatant absence of an intellectual property assignment agreement. You will also find certified, time-stamped commit logs proving conclusively that I am the sole architect and author of the Ironclad Protocol. Finally, there are internal emails proving that Julian explicitly orchestrated my termination exactly 3 days ago for the sole purpose of stealing my unvested equity before this exact meeting took place. I paused, letting the devastating gravity of the physical evidence sink heavily into the room, before delivering the final, fatal blow. The product you are attempting to purchase for $400 million does not belong to Julian. He does not own it. I am the sole owner of it. All the remaining color instantly drained from Julian's face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. His entire paper empire was spontaneously combusting right in front of his eyes. He stumbled forward, practically falling over his own expensive leather shoes, and grabbed the sleeve of my suit jacket. His previous arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced rapidly by a pathetic, desperate, and sickeningly sweet begging tone. "Hannah, please, you have to listen to me," Julian stammered, his eyes wide and leaking actual tears of pure panic. "We can fix this right now. Just type in the authentication key. I will give you your job back this second. I will give you double your original equity. I will make you a full partner. Just unlock the system before they walk away." I slowly reached up and removed his trembling hand from my jacket, treating his touch like a highly toxic substance. I leaned in extremely close, invading his personal space, and whispered directly into his ear so only he could hear the absolute zero temperature of my voice. "I do not unlock my code for people who call it spaghetti trash." I stepped back, leaving him swaying unsteadily on his feet, and turned my full attention back to the formidable corporate attorney from Apex Global. As the sole, legally recognized owner of this intellectual property, I announced to the entire room, I am officially revoking OmniVault Network's unwritten, informal license to utilize my encryption architecture, effective immediately, citing gross commercial copyright violation and malicious fraud. The attorney did not hesitate for a single second. She was a brilliant apex predator who recognized another predator, and she knew exactly which side of the table held the actual value. She calmly reached out, picked up the thick, beautifully bound acquisition contract that Julian was supposed to sign, and deliberately tore it directly in half. She dropped the pieces onto the table like meaningless confetti. "The $400 million acquisition of OmniVault Networks is officially terminated," she stated coldly, looking right through Julian. Then, she turned her piercing eyes toward me, a faint, highly respectful smile finally breaking through her stoic demeanor. "However, Apex Global remains highly interested in acquiring the Ironclad Protocol. We would like to open direct negotiations with you, Miss Moore, for the outright purchase of your intellectual property. Furthermore, we are currently in need of a new vice president of cybersecurity, and I believe you are uniquely qualified for the position." The transition of power was absolute and instantaneous. Over the next hour, a completely new, hand-drafted preliminary agreement was drawn up right there in the boardroom. I stood at the head of the table, holding the heavy gold pen that Julian had brought for his own coronation, and signed a massive licensing and employment contract directly with the executives of Apex Global. When I finally walked out of the glass boardroom, I did not look back. I knew exactly what I was leaving behind. Julian was completely collapsed on the floor next to the mahogany table, holding his head in his hands, crying audibly. His company now possessed absolutely zero core technology, and by tomorrow morning, he would be facing a mountain of massive federal fraud lawsuits from his furious investors and board members. Marcus was sitting frozen in a chair, staring blankly at the wall, his shiny corporate career permanently destroyed. I stepped into the private glass elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the door silently slid shut and the elevator began its smooth descent down the glittering Austin skyline, I pulled my smartphone out of my pocket. I opened my secure administrative application, typed in the phrase spaghetti_trash_override, and pressed execute. The system seamlessly unlocked for its new rightful owners. I looked out over the city, took a deep breath of absolute victory, and finally smiled. Thank you so much to all of our amazing listeners for tuning in to this incredibly satisfying story today. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please let us know your city and country in the comments below. As we mentioned earlier, if you found today's journey of corporate justice thrilling and want to support our team, please consider joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. You will gain immediate access to our absolute best, highly detailed, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube anymore. Just scan the Patreon QR code right on your screen, or use the direct link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. We deeply appreciate your support, and we cannot wait to share more incredible stories with you over on Patreon.